Welcome back. South Africa's G20 presidency has put the issue of Africa's debt and debt costs on the agenda for the grouping. Some critics would say that the continent has simply borrowed too much, but a more nuanced approach shows that the true problem lies in the cost of that debt. Bronwyn Seaborn caught up with Ndidi Okonkwo Nwuneli, president of the One campaign. Let's take a look.
The high cost of capital. African countries have not borrowed as much as many of our counterparts in the West. In fact, when you compare Nigeria to the US, our debt in terms of its quantum size is minuscule. However, we've borrowed at the wrong cost, often for the wrong purposes as well. When we look at the cost of capital issue, African countries borrow at 500% more than their counterparts in other world regions. Even if we just zero in on bonds in particular, the average rates that African countries have borrowed at is 9.8% relative to Germany or the US, that's closer to 3%, Latin America closer to 6%, Asia closer to 8%. And so there's no way that we can even compare. And this is linked to a risk premium where investment in Africa is perceived as too risky and really linked to a bias and structural barriers that have kept us in the state we are today. For me, if we don't tackle this urgently, we'll continue to face a situation where African countries are paying out more than what is coming into our continent, where African governments are having to choose between paying debt and paying teacher salaries, salaries for nurses and doctors, investing in infrastructure. And we repeatedly see that many of our countries cannot invest in infrastructure and growth because they do not have available resources. And this has to be addressed urgently, not only by African leaders, but at a global level. And that's why it's such an important issue for the G20.
We're going to unpack all of that in a lot more detail, but I want to hone in on what you said about the ratings, because I believe it's a good starting point. You talk about how these ratings are really skewing what Africa can access and at what price. How did we get there? How did we get to these ratings? Because it must indicate either a flawed system or that the data sets that are being looked at are perhaps not at whatever standard needs to be looked at. Just explain a little bit in terms of how we got there.
Yeah, so I would say it's a combination of issues, and you've started to unpack them. First is data. Number one, Africa does not own most of its own data. Many of our countries, many of our communities, and even investors are dependent on third-party data generated by the IMF, the WHO, the FAO, and other agencies around the world. Much of this data is not only old, it is not sectorial, and it's not relevant to the timely advances that are occurring in the countries. Oftentimes, the continent is grouped as a whole. So something happening in Sudan affects the rating in Kenya, which is this misconstrued notion that Africa is a country, when it is a continent of 54 very diverse countries at varying levels of development. And so data is key. And we have a part to play as Africans in generating timely data, in owning that data, and providing sectorial data, providing risk data, and actually being over generous with the data we have, but also ensuring that it's reliable and it's trusted. And that has a lot to do with our internal components. Now, in terms of the structural barriers, so the credit rating agencies also have not done a good job in terms of how they source data from Africa. These are the global rating agencies I'm referring to, how they source data from Africa, how they use that data, and how that data is communicated. Some of them have one office that covers the entire continent, and they rely a lot on third-party data. Africa Practice, in partnership with Africa No Filter, quantified the cost of negative reporting just on African elections at 4.2 billion. UNDP has quantified the cost of this negative bias at over 74 billion. And so when we think about the cost of ratings and how we've gotten here, it's been structural, but it's also been linked to quite careless approaches that we see many of our rating agencies using. I also think the bond markets and the traditional lenders have also relied on very traditional risk assessment tools that haven't taken into consideration the nuances on the African continent. And finally, I don't think we've done enough to elevate success stories. Beyond the unicorns that we celebrate on the African continent, success stories in sectors like food and agriculture, like infrastructure investments. And we're starting to see some of those success stories bubbling up with the Hoover Institute and Stanford partnering with us to release data from IFC investments over the last 3 decades that show that these investments in projects generated 6 times S&P 500. We need more of those success stories bubbled up. We need partnership with media, with governments, to showcase the progress that we've made as a continent, because we're stuck and have been stuck in this narrative that Africa is too risky, it's a black hole, it gets too much money, and that money is squandered. That's unacceptable, and it's not the reality that we face today.
You talk about challenging that narrative, and you talk about owning our data sets and really taking accountability almost as Africans for the problem so that we can move forward into solutions. One of the solutions being put forward is that we actually have an African ratings agency. Do you think that solves some of this?
I think there are merits to having an Africa rating agency, but we have to remember that we also exist in an international ecosystem. And so while that rating agency can check some of what the global rating agencies produce, and that's why it's important to have it as a compass, as a base, as an opportunity to challenge perceptions or ratings that are contrary, we still need to address the structural barriers. I think it's not an either or situation, it's an and situation. And we need an African rating agency, and we need global rating agencies to also adjust their approach to the continent. We need to drive growth on our continent, which is why we need our own systems and structures that elevate us. And I've recently started seeing that when the global rating agencies produce a rating of an institution or a country, that we challenge it and say, here are alternative facts. And that's why we need our own data and we need our own rating agencies, but it cannot replace the international ecosystem where the structural barriers and the biases have to be dismantled. And so I'm very excited about what we've been doing through this G20 momentum to actually sit with the global rating agencies and challenge them, and also recognize that we have checks and balances that we're putting in place to hold them accountable to deliver free and fair financing for our people.
You bring the G20 into the conversation, and it is, when we have South Africa holding the leadership of the G20 this year, at least, really putting Africa front and foremost on the agenda there. And when we talk about data sets and we talk about ratings agencies, is there really some kind of discussion that can happen there at the G20 level, even if it's at the point of help us invest in our data gathering, give us the tools to do that. I think a lot of the time we speak very high level about what can be done. There's these big frameworks that need to be put in place, and yet it can be as simple as we actually just need X, Y, and Z, and we can give you the data set.
Yeah. So I think, first of all, we're really proud that South Africa is hosting the G20 and Africa is hosting the G20 for the first time. And this is an opportunity for us to elevate not only the importance of fair financing for growth for the African continent, but this issue also affects other continents. Where there's no fair financing, you can't drive economic growth, you can't address poverty, unemployment, and the other barriers to development. So for me, putting the cost of capital firmly on the table and the issues around structural barriers are critical. The second is that really, a lot of the debt that African countries are currently burdened with are from other countries in the G20. Some of them are structured as Eurobonds, some of them were structured as Asian, whatever it was. These countries have an important role to play in the restructuring that has to happen. And so elevating that is critical. And for me, it's beyond data. It's also saying, what is the ownership that the rest of the world has to take in dismantling the barriers, but also creating new frameworks for fair financing. And we want to see not only that the G20 recognizes this issue and it's front and center because of the human costs, but also the development challenges that it poses, but that there's a clear roadmap that the G20 agrees to that there's ownership around the table of what countries have to do within their own sphere of influence to dismantle. And we recognize that might not be accomplished in the next 4 months, and that it has to extend beyond this current G20 and address the next 3 G20s so that we continue to track the progress. Because if we do not have fair financing, we can't invest in growth, we can't invest in infrastructure, we can't drive a catalytic change, and we can't elevate the social contract that we have with our citizens, which leads to peace and stability, which is a gift for the world. So for me, that shared commitment to this is beyond data, but is actually saying, can we look at some of the roles that those countries have played in creating the imbalance that we have today?
Because that's exactly it, right? We want to talk about, changing the narrative around Africa, and that's speaking to, this is not necessarily an African problem.
It's not.
This is a global problem.
It is a global problem
that needs to be addressed because of the potential that comes from Africa, and that only to the benefit of the world, right?
Exactly. And when we think about Africa's potential, it's to...
In reality today, our critical minerals and value addition in our critical minerals benefits the world. If there's no financing to invest in value addition on the continent, there's a disservice to the rest of the world, right? We cannot export raw critical minerals and have fair pricing and grow jobs and growth and a stable source of supply for the world. Africa can produce the health workforce for the future. We have the youngest population. We have digital AI. We have all these tools. How can we elevate that? Creative industries, ag and food. We can feed the world. So as we think about the growth sectors, we need investment capital that's priced fairly so that Africa can contribute its fair quota and be recognized as an equal player. And this is where the cost of capital issue is critical. This is why it's important, and this is why it's timely. And we expect to see some strong commitments coming out of the G20 around these issues.
That was Ndidi Okonkwo Nwuneli, president of the One Campaign.